All right, everybody. My name is David Rand. I am the host of the Liberty Portal podcast. I was working for Americans for Prosperity when we got to engage in a lot of the issues that we talked about today. So I am passionate about these, and I'm excited to partner with young voices and everybody to build this movement for more property rights to solve problems that government creates. And I love this this connection that we have here. Oh, yeah, without the music. Thank you, sir. All right. Beach Boys, 0. Us, 1. All right, so we're going to start off, just talk about the mission and vision for your guys' organizations, and we'll start out with you, Kat.
Sure. I'm Kat Dwyer. Thank you guys for having me tonight. Thank you.
Yes.
And I'm with PERC. We're the Property and Environment Research Center. We're based here in Bozeman, Montana, and we're a 43-year-old conservation research organization. And we are the national leader in market solutions for conservation. So what is that and what does that mean? We take a different approach, sort of the status quo. We would call that political environmentalism, is an approach where you lobby and you litigate to get the conservation or environmental outcomes that you desire. Our approach, we look for, rather than zero-sum solutions, we look for collaborative, voluntary solutions. So we research issues and now we're actually doing on-the-ground work to implement some of these ideas. But we look for environmental solutions that utilize property rights, voluntary exchange, and partnerships to deliver good conservation outcomes for land, water, and wildlife.
And Kendall.
Well, hi, I'm Kendall Cotton. I'm the president and CEO of the Frontier Institute. We're a free market think tank based right here in Montana, in Helena. And I founded it just 2.5 years ago. So we're kind of the new kids on the block. We haven't been around like PERC has been for so long, but we share similar ideals. We are dedicated to solving problems with more freedom rather than more government. So we believe that when government is small and limited, more people can thrive in Montana. So we focus on where government gets in the way of people building homes, starting a business, getting a job. And we put together powerful research, data, and tell really compelling stories to help break down those barriers so all Montanans can thrive. That's kind of our mission. So that's what we're all about. And that obviously has led us today where we're focused intently on affordable housing in Montana, because that's honestly one of the biggest issues that you hear if you talk to anybody on the street.
So for both of you, and we'll just go sequentially, just back and forth, the challenges that Montana faces right now, let's talk a little bit about those so we can set up how we're going to address those challenges. We're planning for the future. That's the name of this event. What are the challenges facing Montana from PERC's point of view? Well, let's not get into solutions yet. Just like, what do you see as the challenge?
Well, certainly the rapid growth that we're experiencing here, and especially in Gallatin Valley. More people means more people using resources. There's more people moving into the WUI, the wild urban land interface, which means they're living on the edges of our forests. And so that just sort of presents an opportunity for more conflict, whether that be wildfire, human wildlife conflict, or just resource use. So I think that growth has a serious impact on the environment.
More to add?
Yeah, I would kind of add to that. I would say that I think kind of painting with a really broad brush, I think probably most of the challenges that Montana's facing right now can be boiled down to shortages. We have too many people moving here or living here and not enough things for them. Not enough healthcare, not enough access to schooling, education, not enough access to an affordable home for somebody to live in. And name it. I mean, I think that supply shortages are really the challenge facing a growing state like Montana.
So we have this demand, and a lot of people point to demand for living here as the problem. So what we need to do, right, is that we need to make sure that people don't move here. So we got to get rid of Yellowstone, right? We gotta stop advertising Montana, right, and just like keep people out. But that won't work, will it?
No.
Why not?
There's some constitutional issues with that, I think. But.
Well, yeah, the Constitution has some barriers to saying you can't move here legally. Number one. Number two, like, people don't want to just move here because they saw Yellowstone, right? They want to move here because this is a great place to live. Additionally to that, when people move here, that adds to our state, right? They bring jobs and talent and skills and things like that. The question is how do we incorporate them into the state in the best way possible, and where has government been the barrier?
Yeah.
So what are some of those barriers that you see when folks come in that they're facing when they first come to the state?
Yeah. I guess I think we all in this room probably recognize that Montana has something special, right? We're pretty darn lucky to be living in this state. We have the privilege of being one of the few places left in the world where you can be at your office job in Bozeman, and then 20 minutes after work, you can be riding up the mountain on your bike. You can be hiking up the M. We have this access to the outdoors that's just right adjacent from these growing urban areas. That's amazing. Lots of places like Denver and other places, you have to travel, hours to get to places like that. So it's a privilege what we have here. And I think that there's a unique challenge in saying, let's preserve that. Let's make sure that, we can keep this thing that's special going as long as possible. And then recognizing too that we can't stop growing. So the big question is, how do we grow in a way that preserves the character of our state, keeps the special things about it that we love, but also accommodates the people that want to move here that are going to benefit everybody by bringing their talents and families and their businesses to help grow our economy. So that's the big challenge from my perspective.
And how does the growing population affect the environment, specifically from PERC's point of view, and what does the solution look like?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, sort of as I mentioned, one example with forest management, people moving into the WUI, that just creates greater risk for wildfire, right? And we can't stop that growth. And I wouldn't advocate for trying to stop that growth. To your point, there's constitutional issues with that, and just moral issues with that. So I think from our perspective, in that specific instance, we're looking at ways to reduce sort of the regulatory and legal barriers to doing the type of forest restoration work we need to do to lower the risk of wildfire. So there's that's not ending the problem of people moving into the WUI, but it's finding a way to make the WUI more livable and less of a risk for wildfire.
So what are those regulatory and legal barriers in wildfire management specifically?
Well, I would say the environmental review process is a huge piece of that. I think we've kind of won the battle of acknowledging that active forest restoration is necessary. There was certainly a long period of time where we kind of had the environmental movement had this attitude of, you don't touch the forest, and that's the best way to care for it. And sort of ecologists and fire scientists have acknowledged today that we've altered natural fire cycles, and we've altered our forest ecosystems through a century of fire suppression and decades of having this hands-off approach. And what that has resulted in, putting out every fire as soon as it starts and ending logging and that sort of thing. It's created an atmosphere where our forests are basically tinderboxes. They're overgrown, they're too dense. That makes them more susceptible to disease. It makes them more susceptible to insect infestation, and it makes them just prime for wildfire. And our regulations and laws have not caught up with what the science says today. And there are many hurdles to actually getting forest restoration work done on the ground. One of PERC's recent reports that we put out in the last 6 months actually found that it takes an average of about 5 years to from the time you start the NEPA process to being able to actually do work on the ground. It's an average of 5 years before you can really get that work done, and then litigation happens, and then projects get delayed even further than that. So reducing some of those barriers and having sort of our regulations be caught up with the science and our understanding of forest management today is one of the areas that we need to work on.
So one of the things that the campaign for affordable housing from Frontier and from allied groups like Americans for Prosperity was to end California housing. What is California housing? What was that style of housing is? How is Montana ending it?
Yeah. Well, so if we're gonna, kind of point to the right direction here with solving our housing crisis, we have to kind of figure out where we don't want to go first, right? So let's figure out what Montana's hell would be like. And I think that it's pretty fair to say, I think every Montanan's hell would be that Montana becomes like LA. I don't think anybody wants to have our state become like California. And the funny thing about that is that 100 years ago, LA, in newspaper advertisements trying to entice people to move there from places like New York, was advertising things that were a lot like Montana. So they were saying, hey, there's fresh air here in California. There's sunlight. There's access to the outdoors. You can go on the hiking trails right from your home in the city. You can, hit the beach. And that was something that was enticing to people. And lo and behold, you see California now and it's concrete jungle. It's, miles of urban sprawl that's taken over all the open land. And I don't think that's a fate that Montana wants to see. So the question is, what caused California to go down that path? And so David mentioned California housing. We actually call it California zoning. And so zoning is a type of regulation that essentially tells people where you can build certain types of homes and where you can't. So it's land use planning, and it's one way that our communities try and kind of dictate what people can do with their property. In California, they pioneered this really strict style of zoning that basically said that the only types of homes you can build in the city center, are going to be functionally the most expensive types of homes. The single family homes on a large lot, with a big yard, those are actually, if you ask a builder, the most expensive types of homes to build. It gets less expensive to build homes as you add more units on one lot. And so homes like duplexes or triplexes or accessory dwelling units, those end up actually being cheaper by design, more affordable by design. And the problem with California and cities like LA is that they've essentially zoned out the most affordable types of homes, the duplexes, from like 2/3 or 3/4 of their city center. And what that does is it forces development out into the surrounding areas. It sprawls outwards then, because you can't stop population growth. And so if you're not going to accommodate it in the city, it's going to just sprawl outwards. And so that's how we've got the LA that we know today. So one of the things that we say is that we need to be careful to make sure that Montana cities are not zoned like LA, because if that's the case, we can expect them to grow like LA. And in 25 years, Montana's going to be like California, and we don't want that future.
So a lot of people will say, if we allow for higher density, we'll have people who come here who don't vote the right way, don't think the right way, or do the right things. What do you say to that?
I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong. I think actually, if you look at the cities that have been the most obstinate against allowing new housing construction in their communities, have had the strictest zoning measures, those are the places that have class conflict. They have, renters unions forming, and they have a lot of animosity towards, folks who are more wealthy. And that leads to, I think it probably lends itself, at least from a Montana perspective, to more of a, East Coast, West Coast liberal style environment. If you look at the places that accommodate more housing and more not lax regulations, but more accommodating regulations, those are areas where actually there's more Republicans, funny enough, because there's young families who can afford to live there, who are having kids and putting their kids in schools and paying taxes. And that's certainly consistent with kind of the overall politics of Montana. And so, anyway.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, just to summarize the same direction, the one way to make sure someone doesn't believe in the American dream is to box them out of it.
Yeah.
And make sure that they don't get the chance at it.
Yeah.
And so what kind of resentment does that build when you say, yeah, I know what you want is to own your own home, but you're not going to get that chance because we've already regulated it out of existence.
Yeah, well, and I'll just add one more thing too. It's from a Montana perspective, it's like, okay, people are moving here and we have to figure out a place to put them. That's not going to change our state and make it something that we don't want and we don't love. So we can either allow our cities, free up our cities to grow a little bit denser so we can contain the population growth there, keep it there where it's already urbanized. Bozeman's already a city. And keep the development there and away from the ranch land surrounding Bozeman, the rural communities surrounding Bozeman. So they're not changing the character of rural Montana, which I think all of us in this room think is pretty special. So from a Montana perspective, it's like, we need to do something to accommodate population growth so we can save our state and save the character of all the things that we love about it.
How is PERC working to prevent outfill and more of a spread out landscape where we're encroaching on these wilderness areas?
Yeah, and I'll just say like that's not necessarily that's not the goal of what our work is doing, but I think it's a byproduct of some of our projects. So we actually have several sort of pilot projects happening in Paradise Valley, which has been discovered, thanks in part to the show Yellowstone. And that valley is being bought up and subdivided, and there are, ranchettes and second and third homes filling the valley, and it's heartbreaking because it's a beautiful space. And PERC is interested in conserving that valley because we're interested in conserving wildlife migration corridors. That's where migrating wildlife, they come out of Yellowstone National Park, and they actually find their winter range on the private ranch lands in that valley. And it serves as really critical habitat for them in the winter. So some of the projects that we're doing there, we're working with ranchers to basically one of the projects is to do like a habitat lease. So, conservation leases are a popular thing. Montana is actually like the leading state in the country. I think there's over like 6 million acres set aside through conservation leases. However, those are in perpetuity. And the landowner is giving up some portion of their rights to that land forever. And they're giving up those rights for their children and their grandchildren. So there's a lot of landowners who aren't interested in participating in a conservation lease. So PERC is trying to offer a different agreement that is more flexible and it doesn't last forever. And it can be renegotiated. So one of those looks like basically us helping pay for and set aside a portion of one rancher in particular, his ranch, specifically designated now for elk winter range. So the cattle is separated from the elk with wildlife-friendly fencing. That habitat is set aside. He does, measures to sort of remove invasive weeds, do controlled burns, that sort of thing to improve the habitat for the elk. But his cattle are separated from the elk, so he doesn't have to deal with the cost of having elk winter on his grounds, because elk impose huge costs from brucellosis, which is a disease that elk transfer to cattle. It causes cattle to abort their young. It can cost a rancher, upwards of $150,000 to quarantine their their cattle. So understandably, ranchers are not keen necessarily on providing this habitat, but if we can find flexible solutions to compensate them for that, then we can help conserve these open spaces, conserve this habitat. And to Kendall's point, that helps keep sort of the character of Montana that we all want to preserve.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and add to that. I think that there's kind of something unique about Montana because I think most of our industries historically have been reliant on our natural resources in abundance, right? So we've had, timber communities that rely off the land. We've had mining communities, and we've had tourism dependent communities too that rely on our natural beauty. And I think that's really set up a unique situation in Montana that I don't think is similar to other states, where where the people who live here understand that we have a role to play with the environment, right? That just because we are deriving our living off the land doesn't mean we need to destroy it. It means we have a responsibility to be good stewards of our land. It means that you log the forest to make sure it's going to be there 50 years down the road so your children can continue to hunt that area, right? That's kind of something that's uniquely Montanan. And I think that it leads to this area where I think if you talk to a lot of Montanans in Paradise Valley or in these rural areas, they kind of know what needs to be done. People, a lot of the loggers, I like to say, I was telling Brian earlier that I think if you talk to a Montana logger, they're like the biggest environmentalists you'll ever find. They're the ones who say, I want this forest to be healthy for years to come because this is where I live, work, and play. And so I think that when it comes to some of these regulatory things that we're talking about with permit reform, like Cal was mentioning, and housing and zoning, it's letting Montanans build and address these big challenges that Montana's facing. It's letting them do something that they already know they need to do.
So the state current conservation program is permanent, and it seems like a bit of a perverse incentive. It sets up a wrong set of incentives to make it permanent and forever. So should the state consider a seasonal conservation license? What would that look like? And is that something that PERC has worked on?
Well, no, because we like free market solutions. we don't go to the government for our solutions. But, these conservation leases, it can be the government sort of making these agreements, but it's also often just private conservation groups that are facilitating these agreements. And I mean, if it's a voluntary agreement, that's up to the individual. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with those agreements. But PERC's perspective is there should be a broader menu of options for landowners to choose from. And providing greater flexibility means we can attract more landowners to participate in this type of conservation. And to Kendall's point, the landowners, like the ones we work with in Paradise Valley, they're incredible conservationists. They know what needs to be done. They don't hate elk. They just don't want to have to bear the full brunt of providing habitat for elk. So if we can help shoulder some of that cost for them, then we can help them be better stewards of the environment.
So one of the things you said that is a supply problem right now for Montana, additionally to housing affordability, is education and healthcare. What's Frontier's vision in that space?
Yeah, I guess I'll speak to both of those. I mean, so healthcare, everybody knows we have a healthcare shortage in the state. We don't have enough doctors here. There's like 12 counties that don't have a local primary care physician. These are counties in eastern Montana where you got to drive an hour into Billings to get to the doctor. And that's not good. That leads to emergency room scenarios, where you're delaying care too long. And so how do we face that challenge? Well, from our perspective, the first place we should look is where government's standing in the way, doctors coming here, getting licensed and getting to work, treating patients. And so there's a lot of regulations in healthcare, let me tell you. And some of those regulations are focused on, putting up barriers essentially to folks when they move here to get licensed to work. People who are coming to Montana, a lot of them recently too, in the last couple of years, they're doctors who are licensed in good standing in another state, and they move here, and it takes like 3 or 4 months to get licensed to treat patients here. That's not good. They've already proven that they're qualified. Why does things change when they come over our border from Wyoming? That's a challenge that we need to face in Montana. So one of the projects we've supported in the governor's office, Governor Gianforte has tackled, is just trying to streamline that licensing process, all this occupational licensing, they call it, to make it easier for doctors to treat patients here in Montana.
That's great. And in education?
Yeah, well, in education, it's creating more options for people, because right now the only option available is your local government-run public school, and that doesn't work for everybody. There's kids who need more focused attention. There's kids, maybe kids with special needs who would benefit from being in a smaller classroom setting. And one of the problems in Montana is that we've been behind the curve with a lot of states that have implemented more choice in education and empowered families to be able to go and make decisions and select options for their kids that are outside of just the standard public school option. So we in Montana have been advocating for charter schools, allowing kind of these innovative education options that are oftentimes targeted towards kids with like dyslexia or autism or something that there's a specific need, flexible curriculum standards. And then empowering families with special needs kids to be able to send their kid to a school of their choice. And that's a big deal for us.
Yeah. So, and then in the regulatory reform for housing, we talked about it in abstract, but we haven't got into what the bills did this session.
Oh.
And we had a lot of bills passed this session in that space. So I just want you to just touch on maybe one or two that you feel like is particularly powerful, especially as compared to other states that are looking at some of the problems.
Yeah, well, in fact, the 4 big zoning bills that we were focused on actually just got signed today by Governor Gianforte. So we are definitely celebrating that today because that's a big deal. So other states in the country, all of these problems that we just laid out with affordable housing and all these regulations, these are problems that other states do have, and they've been struggling with them for a long time, and they haven't been able to pass these sorts of reforms yet. Some states have, but not to the scale of a huge package of legislation like we're seeing today. So the legislation that we championed this legislative session are going to allow to build some of those more affordable starter homes like duplexes in the cities. They're going to allow for people to be able to put in accessory dwelling units on their property in cities. So accessory dwelling units, for those who don't know, are like a apartment over your garage, converting your basement to rent it out to a college kid. Building a house, kind of a mother-in-law suite in your backyard to accommodate your family members. So those are going to be legalized now and don't have to go through all the red tape. Thirdly, they're going to be allowing in commercial zones building mixed use development, so people can actually live where they work. That's a really great thing. And then the big bill, there's a big comprehensive bill, and really what that does is it streamlines all of the permitting process for housing. So it says, everybody sees in the newspaper, every time there's a subdivision, all the neighbors come out and they say, we don't want this in our backyard. And they come up with all the reasons. Well, what this bill does is it front loads that whole process and says, okay, everybody come to the table. Let's agree on the plan. And once they implement the zoning map and we've all agreed to the rules, then from there on out, we're not going to do public hearings after that because everybody's already agreed to the rules. Then it's just a streamlined permit process where as long as your home or your development that you're planning conforms with the rules, then you're good to go. So that's going to streamline development and get a lot of homes built.
So as far as we see the state acting to encourage more infill, we have PERC encouraging like the private sector solution with these private leases for seasonal land use corridors, migration corridors. Sorry, apologies. Yeah. What is there a prospect for federal reform for forest reform, and what is the best bet for that to look like?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's something we're actively working on, and it is happening at the federal level. Something that actually happened today, your big success, things got signed into law today, which is huge. Today for us on our end of things, something called a cottonwood fix was actually just moved forward out of committee. I won't go into all the technicalities of sort of how that works in Congress, but it's not over the finish line yet, but this was a big success today. And what cottonwood is, Bozeman's actually ground zero for cottonwood. It's basically it was a Ninth Circuit Court ruling, and the Ninth Circuit Court is sort of notoriously progressive, and it has jurisdiction over the West Coast, Montana, Arizona, and Idaho. And it basically it opened the door for litigation to create roadblocks to forest restoration. And in our backyard here in Bozeman, one project that actually is completely critical to the growth here in this community, the Bozeman Municipal Watershed Project, was delayed by over 15 years. In fact, I think it's about 18 years that it was delayed. The scoping for that project started in 2005, and the need of that project was to basically create a fire break and sort of thin and restore the forest around our watershed. Now, if a wildfire rips through that watershed, the city has estimated we only have 3 days of drinking water. So this work is urgently needed. And there are wildfires that happen all around this watershed. So it could happen, honestly, at any moment. And cottonwood was one of the tools that activists who didn't want to see this work happen, who sort of have that hands-off philosophy to forest management, they wielded that strategically as a weapon to delay this work. So today, passing out a committee in both the House and the Senate was a fix for that, which would basically undo that as a litigation tool, and would allow us to streamline some of these projects and actually get work done on the ground to restore our forests.
And that's sponsored by Senator Daines, right?
That's right. Yeah.
That's right. Mm-hmm. So that's all my questions. I have had my curiosity satiated somewhat, but I imagine you guys have some. So if you guys would mind, you just speak up, ask a question. That's great. I will repeat the question before you guys go, though, just so that it's heard in the camera and we have it for the podcast. So, yes.
My question's for Kendall. With the last thing you said about streamlining the permitting processes, is there any way to hold local governments accountable to? So, for instance, in Missoula, there's quite a few positions that people's jobs is to make sure people can understand the process. And I understand, I'm guessing that it's going to be a lot easier to understand. So is there
hopefully
a way to get less government waste with getting
Yeah.
those positions?
So in the city of Missoula, there are positions that exist to apparently be the interface between the general public and the government. And what this bill will do is eliminate a lot of the need for that position, is what I'm hearing you saying. And Is that a good thing? That sounds like a good thing that you agree with. And how should we think about those roles? Do they transform or do we get rid of them? And
I'm gonna do a roundabout way, but I am gonna answer your question. So one of the most interesting terms that I've heard over the last couple of years is this term called cost disease socialism. And the idea is that when you subsidize demand and you restrict supply with regulations, you create this death spiral of costs. Everything gets more expensive, not just the products like housing, but also the cost of administrating the permits to get that stuff approved. So it makes government bloated. And that's how you get big government. And that's what we're seeing today in today's housing market in Montana. And so one of the things Missoula was dealing with is they were actually, so their permits were egregious, even compared to other cities in Montana. And, if people are waiting months, years to get new housing projects approved. And one of the complaints from the city was that we just don't have enough staff to review all these permits and get them approved fast enough and get them out the door. And the response is like, well, we should have less regulations for the staff to review. Like, why are they so complicated that we need more government employees, full-time employees to review all this stuff? Why don't we make it simpler and easier? And hopefully, like Kaylee said, require less government in order to make that happen. So I think with the bills that were passed today, I think that hopefully over the next 3 years, as they implement this stuff, we're going to see hopefully some streamlining in government. I don't know if that leads to less positions, but hopefully it leads to a little less pressure on your property taxes.
Yes, ma'am.
Could you give the numbers of those bills so that we can look them up?
Yeah.
All those numbers of all the bills off the top of your head.
Yeah.
Memory test for Kendall. Go.
Okay, so there's 4 big ones that we are watching. So the first one is Senate Bill 323. It's from Senator Jeremy Trebus in Great Falls.
Oh, you're giving us sponsors too.
The next one is Senate Bill 245, and that's from Senator Daniel Zolnikoff from Billings. The third one is Senate Bill 382, and that one's from Senator Forrest Mandeville from Columbus. And then the last one is Senate Bill 528, and that one's from Senator Greg Hertz in Polson. The Senate crushed it this year.
Not only bill numbers, but sponsors and where they're from. Let's give this guy a round of applause. Well done, sir. Other questions? There's no bad question. Yes, ma'am.
I have another question for Kendall. We saw big housing packages get introduced in many states this year. Maybe the most comparable in some ways to Montana were Colorado and Arizona, but they died sad deaths. What was it that made everything work so well in Montana compared to
So we saw this come up in other states. You reminded me of my job. Thank you. I was so busy thinking of the answer, I forgot what my role was. So the question was, bills similar to the ones that passed in Montana failed in other states. Colorado and Arizona, what you said? We have the Montana miracle. What has been described in the media as this miracle of this radical change in direction for property rights and planning in Montana. What was the difference maker in the Montana legislative session in 2023, from your opinion?
Yeah, well, Emily, I think you played a role. I think the key ingredient for us is that we started with sound data. So one of the challenges when you're facing a lot of these big issues in Montana is that there's a lot of people who have a lot of opinions. They like to spout off, sometimes in the newspaper, but we don't have a lot of people who get to the truth. And so I think we started off with really good data on what is the extent of the zoning regulations in our cities and how much of a factor are they in our housing crisis. So starting with really good research, we were able to cobble together a really great bipartisan coalition. And I think that was another element too. We had, folks on the left, on the right, coming together on this issue because on these housing and also on these forest issues too, it's not about right versus left. It's something that pretty much everybody can see is reasonable and something that people can get behind. We had folks who were able to approach this housing issue, allowing people to build different types of homes in their yards, from the climate change perspective. This idea of, hey, if we're preventing sprawl out into the environment, that's probably good for the environment and probably over time good for the climate. So we had those type of folks getting on board with it. And then we also had folks like us who believe in free markets and property rights saying that, hey, the government shouldn't be telling you what you can do with your home as long as it's not harming other people. And so we were able to speak to very different ways of approaching this issue. And I think that was the winner.
Yeah, and I do want to not acknowledge Shelter Whitefish played a substantial role in lobbying the Democrats that we needed. We wouldn't have got it passed with just Republicans. Even in a Republican supermajority year, we didn't have any chance without Democrat support. We needed left-wing supporters to make that happen. And on the right, from the grassroots perspective, Americans for Prosperity played a substantial role in promoting thousands of dollars worth of advertisements and iVolunteers and grassroots door-to-door knocking in the middle of January to tell people, hey, we don't want California housing.
Yeah.
So there was a tremendous amount of work across a transpartisan sets of organizations that worked really hard to make that happen.
I have a question for Kat real quick as a follow-up. So on the forest issues, we were just talking about the bipartisanship on the housing stuff. Mm-hmm. On the forest issues, especially at the federal level, is there a lot of bipartisan collaboration? I mean, is this something that's going to pass Democrat, Senate, Republican House?
There was more bipartisanship in the Senate than the House, but there is some, absolutely. And I think there's momentum for more coalition building. And sort of, I was thinking of this as you were answering that question. I think both on the forest issue, land development, housing, zoning, we have really good examples outside of the state of what happens when you don't go the route that we're trying to go right now. So I think that actually, unfortunately, that serves us well. We can point to California and say, do you want, just completely unsustainable, unaffordable housing? Do you want mega wildfires every single summer, right? So we have these examples of what the alternative is. And I think that helps build coalitions because people come around to the, they see what the dark side is, and they recognize that it's time to put partisan divides aside and come together for real solutions.
Any other questions? All right. So thank you so much for coming. Oh yes, sir. Did I miss you?
I got a lot of questions.
Well, give us your best one first, and if we like it, we'll go for two. I'll summarize first for the podcast. So there's this thing called American Prairie Reserve, which is a private conservation group that has bought up a lot of land. And I'm also saying it for the rest of the audience because not everyone might not know as much as you, sir. That has bought up a lot of land and worked with the state and federal government to lease federal and state land nearby their private reserve so that they can have a bison reserve in Montana in the traditional and and what's the word I'm looking for? Ancestral? That's not the right word. Environmentally sound, like the closest thing that they would have had before the settlement of the West. And your question is what the leases for that, how does what she's talking about with seasonal leases relate to APR and that sort of thing?
Yeah, and I would also venture, I don't know if you guys are familiar how long you've been in Bozeman, but they had this Bear Canyon timber sale that DNRC had put up, and you had a group of landowners, homeowners that actually purchased, had the highest bid for the purchase of that timber to leave it standing. So I'm not saying that's good or bad. I can tell you directly that it hurts who I work for when that land is out of production even for a period of 50 years.
Right.
And so just curious as to how that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you're going to like my answer, but PERC's perspective, if it's a voluntary agreement, we're for it. So, in our view, we're working to reduce barriers so that if basically the highest bid wins and we can allow prices to sort of serve their role as a market signal to determine, what is the conservation value of that landscape. And if that land is if a conservationist puts up the highest bid to take that land out of production, then that's the highest valued use of that land according to the market. So that's sort of our take on it.
Yeah, I would say it's not for me to like or dislike, but what I would say is that we've been really promoting industry and retention of certainly of the forest products industry for these woolly issues that you talk about, and we have to have a sustainable and reliable amount of raw material for our operations, right? To build and to grow and to do everything that
Oh, yeah.
we say we like doing. And so, yes, I think it's fantastic that I hunt elk. My kids, we hunt elk. I mean, I'm not naysaying anything. I just
Sure.
would like us to take into account that, first and foremost, more people moving here removes more of that land that's available for us to do things on and for the business that I have to thrive.
And you're in lumber extraction, sir?
Yes, we have Sun Mountain Lumber and Biology.
Oh, okay.
Cool.
Yeah. So his point is that as people move here, that there's a pressure on the wilderness, as you were saying, and there's a pressure on making sure that we have enough wood to build the houses that we got to build all the affordable housing in, right? So how do we kind of balance those? How do we think about that? And then what would you consider to be the bigger barrier, if I may summarize? Is it federal land use policy that's keeping us from being able to log more effectively and have the logging industry that we really want? Or is it the bidding process that is currently happening on private land like APR or like the cottonwood example?
Well, I guess I first would just say I totally acknowledge that we have to be able to extract these resources to build and to live, and these industries are important. I think another piece of that too is that forest restoration is super expensive, and if we can, if it's just the Forest Service funding this, like we're gonna have to. That's taxpayer dollars that are being put to use for that. So if we can, unfortunately, the wood that has to be extracted for the most part are small diameter trees. And there is some kind of cool innovation. I think it's nascent. You may know more about this than I do. But there's some innovation in markets trying to figure out a way to utilize those small diameter trees to make it profitable. So that, timber harvesters can still have a role in the type of forest restoration and extraction that we need to be doing today. So I think there's still a role for the market to be involved in that, in a way that's conducive with what the Forest Service's goals are. In terms of what's the bigger barrier, I mean, from my perspective, it is the permitting process, and it is the ability to wield litigation as a divisive tool to actually stop this type of work. And so to that end, like there isn't necessarily a market solution to that. That is, we have to reduce these barriers, and we have to sort of change the laws and regulations to make this more accessible.
It seems like a market solution to me. Limit government so that people can't weaponize
yes.
government
Right.
against development and against logging projects that might be valuable for both the consumer, the producer, and the landowner. In this case, the federal government or state government. All right. Other questions? Now I'm like hesitant to like go on. You got another one, sir? Are you good? Okay. All right. And I don't want to skip over anybody because we got time. Okay. All right. So I want to thank, first off, I know a lot of folks came here because Americans for Prosperity was recruiting. Thank you, AFP activists and community members, for coming out and hanging out with us. I want to thank the Property Environment Research Center, Kat, thank you so much, and the Frontier Institute, Kendall. Please go out there, subscribe to their newsletters, check them out what they're doing. They're doing amazing research and work to help people get equipped with the best ideas about how to drive peace, progress, and abundance in our society and environmental stewardship. So please go out there and check them out. Like and subscribe this podcast when you're viewing. Hit that notification bell, leave us a comment, feed that algorithm. And then lastly, I want to thank Young Voices for hosting this. Thank you so much, Sarah. Let's give Sarah a round of applause for pulling this all together. Build your voice as a young person trying to make a difference in this world. Reach out to Young Voices. Go to youngvoices.com and let them know that you're interested in partnering with them to make a big difference in driving a vision of a free society together. So thank you so much for coming. Please hang out, have beer and pizza, and we'll chat with you guys some more individually. Thank you.